Hi everybody, thank you for coming and watching us today. So I have with me today the brilliant Julian Humphrys, who I've known for a few years now and never fails to make me smile at all. So we're going to be talking today in a roundabout way about the period known as the Wars of the Roses. We're not going to give you a kind of sort of like standard like typical history lesson where we're going to just give you a long list of battles and what happened at each of them, because that can be a little bit laborious, can't it? So I'm going to talk about a few different things. But first of all, Julian, thank you so much for being here and taking your time out.
Well, thanks for talking to me.
It's always a pleasure. Can you tell us, for some of you, if people haven't met you before, just a little bit about you and what you do?
Well, hi everybody, I'm Julian Humphrys, and I guess that my main role at the moment, I'm one of the trustees of the Battlefields Trust, which is the UK charity which kind of promotes and protects UK battlefields, in other words, battlefields in Britain. And of course, a load of those are from the 15th and the 16th century. When I'm not doing that, I kind of write articles for magazines, and I do scripts for films in museums. So I've just finished one for the Household Cavalry, for example, which is go there and you listen to this thing. So I do that sort of thing. And normally I do a lot of guided tours, but that hasn't quite worked out that way this year. I've had 25 cancelled, but I've saved a hell of a lot of money on coffee and cake, really. You go and you spend a lot. I might as well say, I mean, the last tour I did was around, it was going to be a William the Conqueror tour in Normandy. And he wants to go and see the Bayeux Tapestry and Calais, where he was born, and and all those places. Caen, which of course was involved in the loss of Normandy in the 15th century, and all that sort of stuff. So we arrived in Bayeux with the group, 28 people, and I got a phone call. Bayeux Tapestry's closed because of COVID. Well, never mind. I sort of said to them, well, there's other things we can see. And then the next morning I got a phone call. Everything else is closed because of COVID as well.
Oh no.
So I said to all these medievalists, well, you do like D-Day, don't you? I went to the D-Day tour instead, But we were able to go near to Formigny, which is where the English were finally kicked out of Normandy in 1450. So we got a bit of 15th century in, even if it was for 10 minutes on the way to Omaha Beach. But there we are. So that's me. And as I say, we've been pals for a long time. I think we met at the Bosworth reenactment, didn't we, first time?
2015.
Yeah.
So
we've kept in touch ever since, haven't we?
Yeah, and it's been, I can't believe it's been 5 years. So much has happened.
Yeah.
Apart from this year, when very little has happened, obviously. For 4.5 years, a lot happened. And then it's kind of tailed off, really. So I just wanted to talk a little bit to start with about the background of the Wars of the Roses. And this is just going to be very brief before anybody kind of switches off.
I'll go and make a coffee, shall I?
Yeah, just give me about half an hour. So I think sometimes people don't realise that a root of this disquiet really was to do with the war with France, and sort of you see the 100 Years' War coming to a close during this period. And Henry VI has the marriage alliance with Margaret of Anjou, with Charles VII of France, and it looks like it's going to smooth the waters, but not everybody at court is happy with what's going on, are they? So you're getting these two factions for the king. So you have William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. And obviously, as people who follow the Tudors, we follow the name Beaufort quite a lot. And then opposed, you have Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and of course Richard, Duke of York, who everybody is going to see as a key player in this role. And then what we see a lot of the time is Somerset and York, them sort of being swapped in and out depending on who's in charge and what's going on, and a real sort of rivalry between both of them, which is really characteristic of this period. So actually, before we kind of get the real notable faction that people see, there's been this rumbling and this disquiet going on for quite a while. Now, York took a great part of the military command in France, but then he was recalled and that post was given to Somerset, and this kind of didn't really sit well. And at one point York came back Gloucester spoke out against the king, and at this point I think he was Henry's heir, wasn't he? But he was to be tried for treason, and then he just went and died anyway, I think. And then the trouble kicks in a little bit more here, because Richard then becomes Henry's heir, and at this point Henry and Margaret haven't had any children. So this gives, and it's really complicated. York's claim to the throne goes way back, doesn't it, to the sons of Edward III, and it's really quite complicated, and it's something I think I need to pick apart with either Matt Lewis or Nathan Armin. I think they would be.
Yeah, very basically, I mean, Richard of York had a claim to the throne through both his mum and his dad.
Yes.
Both ways they went back to the children of Edward III. And you could argue, actually, it was a better claim than that of Henry VI.
Yeah.
But of course, he was after the throne to start with. You know, as you're saying, it's a time, isn't it, where, you know, if you've got a weak king, it's essential that you are regent or at the centre of government, because if you're not, you know, whoever is in a very handy position to hoover up all the jobs and the good marriages, etc., etc. So, you know, if Richard of York's not going to be king, you know, the second best thing, and what he really wanted to start with, wasn't it, was to have that central role at court and not be excluded from court, you know, to the benefit of people like the Beauforts, as you were saying.
Yeah, I think once throughout that period, it's sort of dicey, isn't it? I always say I wouldn't want to be king, because you spend your whole time trying to be king until someone kills you, or you are king and then someone tries to kill you again. This is sort of very sort of highlighted in this period. There's lots of toing and froing about who wants to be king, who's going to be king, who's entitled, and it's sort of a very muddy period in that respect. There's lots of changing of hands of the crown, but it's never done smoothly or pleasantly. That there's always something horrible in the background, and there has to be a battle and a this and that and the rest of it. Essentially, let's get to the point where should we go? In 1450 we had Cade's Rebellion, but we can talk about that another time, so people can have a quick look at that. But basically it was a failed rebellion, and it didn't end too well for a large number of people. And in the same year, Somerset surrendered Normandy, which obviously went down like the proverbial lead balloon. But instead of being punished for this because he was within the king's favour, kind of like, let's not mention that again, and then perhaps nobody will notice. And obviously that really didn't come down well. York came back, he raised an army, and I think they kind of were able to come to, I'd say some sort of arrangement isn't quite, but they were able to sort of smooth the waters at that point a little bit. But this, of course, doesn't last forever. Tensions remain high all the time. Margaret does give birth to a son, but at this point, Henry is what we would now call a catatonic stupor, catatonic schizophrenia. And this, of course, is a great opportunity for York to go, well, you know, what can you do? He can't do anything. And so he steps in, and actually he's quite successful, isn't he? He, you know, as a, you know, in the First Protectorate, he's actually quite successful. Margaret, not happy. Somerset banged up somewhere in the background. And, you know, then of course Henry gets better, and it's all switches round again. Yorkists are absolutely fuming about this. Around this time, the 100 Years' War finishes, the French are the victors, and there's just you know, poor Henry VI. He's very mentally unwell. He's running on the coattails of his father and Agincourt and, you know, all this great French victory. And I think he was slightly doomed from the start, to be honest. But eventually we get to the point as well where there's feuding in the north with the Percys and the Nevilles. Interestingly, though, the Beauforts have an association with the Nevilles, don't they? Because John of Gaunt's sister, Joan, married into the Neville family. But then we tend to ally then later on with the Yorkists.
Well, I think the Nevilles were, you know, you go back to the Earl of Westmoreland, a very fruitful family, huge numbers of kids to be found marriages, etc. You know, and if you pull back a bedsheet, you'd probably find a Neville in there, to be absolutely honest. You know, so they were intermarried a lot, you know. But you know, I think that, you know, we always talk, don't we, about, you know, Richard of York and Henry VI. But you're so right to draw attention to conflicts perhaps slightly further down in the sort of social order. So you've got these rivalries, as you rightly say, between the Percys and the Nevilles in the north. But you know, the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, his inheritance, which was a vast thing, wasn't it? You know, he had the Neville lands, but he got the Beauchamp lands as well. It was a very fragile inheritance, and people like the Percys and the Beauforts, you know, they were challenging it. So the chances are that whichever way that the Beauforts and the Percys went, the Nevilles would go in the other direction. Absolutely. Because we say, what if we had a war and nobody turned up? Well, you know, there are reasons why people would turn up, because they've got their local rivalries, haven't they? And they play out on the stage, you know. And you know, you see the hand of Neville in virtually everything, to be honest, in my opinion.
Yeah. As you say, it was almost inevitable that because of on one side, and then obviously we see Warwick allying with York, and that's the big thing that tips a lot of this backwards and forwards. Warwick certainly manages to alienate pretty much everybody in the known world, got up to the point at which he's killed in battle, and I don't think many people probably shed many tears for Warwick by that point, which is kind of sad in a way, but you reap what you sow, and he certainly I think we get to the point where the king recovers, Somerset comes back in, the Yorkists are really miffed by this point, like high level miffed. York raises an army, supported by Warwick, king has to therefore raise an army. All the periods we've seen before where it's been a bit tentative, but they've kind of managed to keep it under wraps. We get to St Albans, everyone hates each other, all hell breaks loose. And here we begin the Wars of the Roses. That was my wonderful introduction in layman's.
All hell breaks loose, yes.
All hell breaks loose.
I don't know if any of the people have been to St Albans, but it's a worthwhile place to visit, because you've got Gabriel, which is this blooming great bell tower in the middle of St Albans, and it was built by the townsfolk, really to sort of say up yours to the Abbey, which is a huge, great place that dominated the place. So they built their own bell tower, and it's still got this bell in it that was around at the time of the Wars of the Roses. So if ever it rings, you're hearing a noise, I suppose, that people would have heard in St Albans. But I mean, I suppose St Albans, the first battle, which is 1455, it was really a kind of punch up in the streets, would be the best way to describe it. What was Richard? So, you know, you've got Richard of York and you've got the Nevilles, and they've been excluded from court, so they take this sort of violent action. But they're not seeking to overthrow Henry VI. You know, at this stage, nothing about that. You know, there's no challenge to him as king. But it's significant who dies, isn't it, at St Albans? Because it's the Earl of Northumberland, a Percy, it's the Duke of Somerset, a Beaufort, and Lord Clifford, who's an adherent of the Percys. So they are significantly, they're all enemies of Warwick and the Nevilles. Perhaps the Nevilles, I should say, rather than Warwick. So it's a case of sort of getting rid of your rivals in that way. But of course that sets off, doesn't it, a long cycle, I suppose, of, you know, revenge and reprisal. You got my dad, I'm going to get your son, and it goes on, doesn't it? And we see it playing out, you know, through the whole period. So it's a brief period of bloodletting, and you know, to a certain extent, things do calm down again afterwards, don't they? You know, but you know that younger Clifford and younger Northumberland and younger Somerset, etc., they're all, you know, they're looking for their chance to get revenge at some stage.
Constantly bubbling under the surface, isn't it? I think one thing that's worth mentioning at this point is that the Wars of the Roses, there were sort of protracted periods of peace, even if it was a bit uneasy at times. It wasn't just, oh God, where, you know, get up in the morning, where are we today?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right, you know, and immediately after this, you know, you've then got 4 years of peace. And it's always, you know, I always get a bit pedantic when I see people say the War of the Roses, because really it's the Wars of the Roses, isn't it? You know, you've got, well, I would say 3 periods of fighting. And whether at the time people saw them as a continuation of what had happened before, I don't know really, to be honest. But, you know, they had different reasons and different causes and different adherents, didn't they? And as you so rightly say, you know, for long years there was peace. And some of the foreign chroniclers said that actually, if you were an ordinary person, the Wars of the Roses wasn't such a bad place to be if you were English, you know, if you were an ordinary person. Not so good if you were a member of the peerage, but if you're my ancestors, you know, who were probably shoveling pig manure outside Hemel Hempstead, or I don't know what, unless an army went through on the Great North Roads, or whatever it was. I think they had a fairly peaceful time.
Yeah, they wouldn't have known.
Early infant mortality notwithstanding, but it was compared to the continent, I think, a relatively peaceful time. But with these brief moments of intense bloodletting, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously you're dragged into this whether you want to be or not at that point. But they probably wouldn't have known what was going on for the best part of the time. As you say, sort of peaceful existence apart from the dung and the infant mortality. It was just everyone getting on with their life.
Yeah.
Doing their thing, really.
Yeah, apart from the infant mortality and the Black Death and the dung and the early marriages, what did the Middle Ages do wrong for us,
Oh dear, right. Yeah. So we see St Albans as a Yorkist victory, obviously, in terms of the losses there. And again, so we've seen this point earlier on where it did start to divide into this sort of, even before St Albans, into this kind of Yorkist and Lancastrian camps. But again, is this something that we've put on it posthumously? I think it is, isn't it, that we've called it the Wars? It's, well, not us personally, but it's been called the Wars of the Roses. We've been given the red rose and the white rose, and it's kind of how we reflect on it. And it was interesting what you said just now. Did they all look at it as one thing, or did they kind of go, well, there was that, and then there was that? Oh, Bosworth. Sort of thing. We look at it like this because we're looking at the whole picture historically, but it was very interesting what you said, that maybe they really didn't do that at all.
Well, I don't think they did. I think they saw them as separate conflicts, and it's quite commonly known, isn't it, that the red rose wasn't really a Lancastrian symbol until really right at the end of what we call the Wars of the Roses. But if some blokes turned up with some red roses on their shields at St Albans, people, who are they? Where's the son of York? Where's the swan of Lancaster? Where's the portcullis of Beaufort? What's that red rose thing? Who are they? So I didn't really, it's a shame because I bought my Swampit Knights, which
yes.
And of course, they didn't worry about that. You've got red roses and white roses on them, but they're a very good way of holding the shields on. But this is what got me interested in the Wars of the Roses in the 60s, when my parents bought me some of these. First one I got was Richard III, actually.
Ironic.
I broke it almost immediately. No, I didn't.
Right, moving swiftly on. So, oh yes, I feel the need to mention very briefly in 1548 a PR move that was epically pointless, the Love Day. So it was basically Henry saying, look, this isn't great. Let's all be friends. And they all kind of went out and had a bit of a parade and pretended to like each other. But the nanosecond that was over, they all went back to their plotting desks, didn't they? And then continued their kind of... Now, Warwick got into trouble around this time for being a very naughty boy with his piracy. So he wasn't always very popular. But I
would say he was popular, maybe not, he was popular with the people, because he was a great sort of propagandist. He knew how to bang the nationalist drum, really. You know what I mean? So things are going badly, but I've duffed up the French bit. Hey, good old Warwick, in that way. I mean, not that ever happens again, does it? But there we are. That's the. I think that's the way to look at Warwick. I don't see him as a great soldier, but he certainly knew how to sort of present himself as something of a hero, or to present the Lancastrians at a later date as these sort of savage Northerners.
Yeah.
To pillage, and he seems to be pretty good at that.
It's that early sort of all this kind of, what I will say is all this, the Tudors invented propaganda business. Not happy with that. This is very much put, as you say, Warwick ran this show for a long time in a great many ways, and he changed sides and this, that, and all the rest of it, and made some hideously bad calls that he really should have seen coming. I
think we need to remember also, I suppose, at this stage of the Wars of the Roses, that Warwick isn't leading the Neville faction. It's the other Salisbury, it's his dad, isn't it? At this stage, so he's like he's perhaps the second in command, might be a way of looking at it. I mean, I'm more sympathetic to Warwick myself, and I see most of what he does sort of defensive, really. I don't see him as an over mighty noble through choice. But if you're married off to some rich heiress when you're a little child and you've got this blooming great inheritance, well, you're going to try and want to hang on to it and ensure that, you know, you get some good marriages for your daughter so that it goes well. And I suppose, you know, if you've got that, you expect to be involved in government, don't you? Because they're going to need you at a local level. So, you know, maybe Warwick doesn't get that he gets perhaps a more bad precedent than he deserves, perhaps. I don't know.
I suppose people tend to.
That's my view. If you don't like it, I can change it.
I suppose maybe then I'm slightly guilty of this, as seeing him as coming in maybe a bit later than he was, if that makes sense. A lot of us, and maybe me, to come in, see him and coming in at that point where he's going, hang on a moment, I think I can use this situation to my advantage.
Yeah.
Which, in actual fact, made him no different from most of them, really.
No.
He just pulled it out the bag a bit bigger for a bit longer.
But it wasn't like he grabbed all this land, you see, or whatever. You know, he has it. And if you had all of that stuff, you would expect to have offices and expect to be listened to, I suppose. But we digress because, you know, we're still thinking about the Earl of Salisbury for 1459, you know.
You do, because that's what happens when you start talking about history.
Yeah.
Right, so we talked very briefly before we came on about Ludford Bridge. So, and I will just very briefly let you mention what happened here, because this is one of your favourite moments of the Wars of the Rose.
Yeah. Well, we should say we're talking now. It's the anniversary of the Battle of Blore Heath, 23rd of September, which is you know, the two sides, I suppose, are gathering forces. That's the way to look at it. So you've got the Earl of Salisbury, so Neville, who's marching south to hook up, I think, with Warwick and co at Ludlow, which was a great kind of Yorkist centre. And they run into a bigger Lancastrian force under Audley, near Market Drayton is Blore Heath. And it's quite a nice place to visit in a way now, because although it's been more enclosed, there's not a lot of building on the battlefield itself. And we know at the time that there was a brook which separated the two armies, and, you know, you've got these hills that go down to this brook. It's all there, so you can visualise it. And in a funny sort of way, it was a sort of Agincourt, because the Yorkists were outnumbered, but they had their flanks secured as Henry V did at Agincourt, with the wood on one side, and then they kind of made a sort of, I don't know what you would call it really, but like a little fort out of their wagons on the other side of their army. So they were in the middle with all their archers, and either through overconfidence or because they were tripped into it, the Lancastrian had a lot of cavalry, and they charged forward down towards this brook and up the other side, and they were shot to pieces by the Yorkist archers. So it was a bit of an Agincourt in a way, that battle, and the Yorkists were successful. And it's also gone down in history because I posted it on Twitter today. That it is said that Margaret of Anjou, who somehow was present at this battle, whether she was or not, I'm uncertain, you know, yeah. But she stopped at this forge not very far away and had her horseshoes put on backwards to fool the Yorkists so they could get away, you know. And what utter nonsense, but it's there on the forge. And the thing what I like about it is they don't say tradition has it that this happens, or it is said that. They say it is at this spot on this forge owned by Fred Bloggs that Margaret of Anjou changed her horseshoes, you know, in that way. So it was a Yorkist victory, but it was a prelude to a catastrophic Yorkist defeat, really, because there was a huge face-off at Ludlow. So Ludlow is a Yorkist town, and you had a Yorkist army gathered in the area, and also a Lancastrian army. And amongst the Yorkists were the Calais Garrison. And we often talk about that this period that there wasn't really a standing army, but there sort of was, because there was always a garrison to keep an eye on Calais. So if you had them on side, you know, they were quite good soldiers, etc. They kind of knew what they were doing. And they'd been brought over under a chap called Trollope, and he was with the Yorkists. But at this period, I think there was a certain amount of reluctance to rebel against the anointed king, you know, even there. And, you know, that the night before the impending battle, Trollope went over to the Lancastrian side. So in the morning, it's just the time now for Richard of York, the much admired Richard of York. Ask Matt Lewis about Richard, he loves him, Warwick, Earl of Salisbury. They're all there. This is their great moment. This is their moment to lead their troops to victory. So what do? They leg it. They disappear. Richard of York goes to Ireland, the others go to Calais, and they leave their troops, and they leave poor old Ludlow to face the music. And the Lancastrians, so let's say, not particularly well behaved at this period. So actually, as a result of Ludford Bridge, the Lancastrians have really gained the upper hand big time. So they may have lost at Blore Heath, but Ludford, which was a fairly bloodless battle, really, because the Yorkists ran away. Their leadership ran away. They've kind of won.
Yeah.
But there are times to be magnanimous, aren't there? And there are times where you've got to kind of think, well, what do we do with our victory? And the trouble is that I find that the Lancasters didn't really do that, and they managed to alienate everybody again. And that meant that when Richard of York and Warwick and co come back, they are able to get enough support to take on the Lancastrians again. But Ludford Bridge is good. Have you been to Ludlow? I'm sure you have.
Well, no, but I'm going to Ludlow fairly shortly for something else that I'm doing, which I will talk to you about another time. Yes.
But it's so important, isn't it? Because of Arthur, Catherine, as well as so it's a wonderful place. And Ludford Bridge is kind of there, and you can just see where it all happened. And the castle's here a good one to visit. I love Ludlow. Really.
That's my principal reason for going. But I'm going with a friend and a history friend, and I think we might make a weekend of it because it's not massively far. It's a bit closer for her than me. Sorry, we're having a conversation of our own now. I forget about this. Yeah. So I will definitely have a good poke around there. I'll probably pick your brain before I go as well.
It's well worth a visit, and you've got Mortimer's Cross within easy distance as well, and there's Stokesay Castle. So it's a wonderful part of the world. I love it up there, really.
Yeah. So and it wasn't as far as I thought from where I am in Leicestershire. So it's definitely, it's been a place I've been meaning to go for a really long time.
Yeah.
So, well, I was meant to have gone by now. Yeah. Yes, moving on. So coming through, what do you say on balance? And this is a sort of a big sweeping question, and I suppose I kind of know the answer. But if you look overall at all the battles that occurred, would you say that the Yorkists or the Lancastrians dominated one more than the other, or was it a fairly even spread?
Well, I suppose until the very end of the Wars of the Roses, the key battles tend to be won by the Yorkists. They do. So they win at Northampton, which is an important victory, in that they get hold of the king. They win the key battle of Towton, which I think affects the whole balance throughout the whole of the period. That's a little bit later. So this is after the exile that we've talked about. So after Ludford, there are some battles, but it comes to a head at Towton, which is outside of Tadcaster. Key battle won by the Yorkists. Then you've got Warwick's rebellion, and 10 years later, two key battles there. So we're talking there about Barnet, and we're talking about Tewkesbury, both won by Edward IV. Yeah. And then we come on to Bosworth. Well, Bosworth is it just goes to show that there was never any inevitability about it. And I'm not a great believer in saying ifs and ands. If only this had happened or if that had happened. But you can see that every time you went on the battlefield, it was a risk.
Yeah. And
it can easily go either way. There's no certainty when you fight in these battles, and you see it in all of them, really. But, it appears that, or whether that's just the chroniclers trying to make a good story of it, you never quite know. But, they always seem to be hanging in the balance, don't they? And then, of course, finally, you've got Henry VII at Stoke.
Yeah.
And again, it's so similar to Bosworth in a way, where you've got a foreign pretender with foreign help coming, uncertainty about who would turn up. But the thing about Henry VII was that he got people to turn up and fight for him. But those two last battles, I don't really see that Bosworth as York v Lancaster. It's Richard versus Tudor. It's a different thing. But in those wars, on the whole, the Yorkists seem to triumph more often than not.
I do. I mean, obviously, I'm not a battle expert, but I do agree about Bosworth. I think it had just come to that point. It was kind of like the now or never. This has come to a point now, and we've got to sort of settle this mess, kind of one way or the other. It's really going to, whatever happens here is going to define the future. Whereas, as you say, with a lot of the other battles, it was a battle of that time, who was going to come out on top, who was going to they could get rid of in that particular battle.
But they thought those would define the future as well, because who knew what was coming after that, if you see what I mean. So anybody that fought at Towton would have seen that as the great battle to define the future. And to a certain extent it did, didn't it, I suppose.
Towton is seen as one of the big ones, if not the big one, really. So it's often described as the bloodiest battle in history. But like a lot of, and it was obviously grim. Well, they all were, but you know what I mean. But it's like, you were talking very briefly before we came on about the numbers that are mentioned and sort of the disputes over that. And what do we know, or what can we be fairly sure about with regards to Towton?
Probably what we know for sure about Towton, you could write on the back of a fag packet. It's very, very difficult because, it's so often said, the chroniclers at the time, what were they trying to do? Were they trying to give us information, in the future to help us recreate the battle? Or were they trying to make points? Were they trying to get across the significance of an action? Were they using classical models? When you see it, for example, even with Bosworth, where people rely very heavily on the ballads of Bosworth, but they're very much about telling an exciting story and actually having words that work within that ballad. So it's very uncertain. So what do we know about Towton? Well, we know where it was because of battlefield archaeology, and it ties in with what people wrote at the time. We know that it was pretty large, and if you look, for example, at the attainders that happened afterwards, you can see that perhaps as many as 2/3 of the periods were present at Towton. So it's a lot of people were present, and they bring along a lot of people because of who they are. We know that. We probably think that the arrival of the Duke of Norfolk, he was one of the Yorkists, turned the balance in the battle, and we know that the casualty rate was very high. But you see people quoting that 28,000 people were killed on that day. Well, this is an extraordinarily high. I mean, 28 people is a disaster, isn't it? Never mind 28,000, because everybody that dies has got family and and loved ones, etc. But 28,000. We're talking about possibly, it's very hard to say, but maybe 2% of the population killed in one day. How do you get that number of people onto the battlefield in the first place? If you look at the big, royal efforts when England invades Scotland, or Henry V takes his army to France, you don't even have 20,000 there. So, for 28,000 people to be there, you're looking at maybe 50,000 people being present in the battle. How do you feed that number of people? How could you possibly do it? And if you were a commander, would you rather have one man at arms who kind of knew his stuff, or 10 kind of blokes that you've dragged off the fields who didn't? Because you've got to feed them. You've got to feed these people, and they didn't have the capacity to do it. So I think that we hugely overestimate the numbers of people that are in the battle. And maybe we overestimate the number of people that were killed. Other accounts say that 8,000 were killed, and
that's a big difference.
Yeah. Huge difference to 28,000. But it's a bit like, in journalistic terms, we talk about facts that are too good to check.
Right.
In the sense that 28,000, get that in your story. That's going to get everybody. Really want that, and you get other things at Towton. You often read accounts that the Lancastrians hid people in the wood in an ambush, but there's nothing in the contemporary sources to say that. Somebody came up with it in Victorian times, and it's been repeated as fact.
The Victorian.
Where do we go? With the chronicles, because they are unreliable. You try and look for administrative records if you can. And, you know, I'm part of the Battlefields Trust, and Anne Curry, who is our chair, she's done brilliant work on, you know, the soldiers of the 15th century, who they were, because you often got indentures, you know, and things like that said who they were and how long they served for. But there's a guy called Simon Paling, and he is working on the History of Parliament project. And he looks at the peers and the former MPs that were present at Towton. And I think we can say that throughout history, we often like to think of, you know, that kind of Blackadder view that the generals sit at the rear, you know, and all the ordinary soldiers are doing the dying. Well, more ordinary soldiers die because there were more of them. But proportionately, throughout history, officers and generals have suffered at least the same level of casualties. And in the First World War, you know, sometimes our generals were too far forward, you know, from where they should be. So you can, you look at that, and it gives you a kind of clue. And we know that at Towton, there were 27 peers on the Lancastrian side.
Wow.
And 22 of them got away. Okay, and there were 18 people that we know were former MPs. Wow. And of those, 14 got away. So we're looking at a casualty figure there of maybe 20%, which is pretty common for that period. So this idea, I think, of this wholesale slaughter of the Lancastrian side, it clearly was bloody by the standards of the time, probably because there were more people there. But I really don't go with this idea that it's the bloodiest battle on English soil at all. I don't think it was even the largest battle on English soil. I get this feeling that probably Flodden was 1513, James IV and the Earl of Surrey. I reckon that was probably a larger and bloodier battle. But that's just my view, and it's based upon rather limited evidence, you know. But I the chroniclers love a big number, don't they? It means a lot. You know, you read about the heralds counting 28,000 dead, but they also say that the dead was strewn over 20 square miles. Well, I can't imagine Garter, King of Arms, riding around two over there.
Another one.
No. Yeah. So it's fascinating. It was clearly a huge tragedy, but nor have I found anywhere where there's great rural depopulation. And, you know, you'd have thought that if 20,000 northerners, because the Lancastrian army was very much a northern army, you know, if they fought together all wiped out, I don't see evidence anywhere of, you know, some villages in Clifford territory not having any men, you know, like you sometimes hear about Flodden. So who knows? But maybe it's been overstated, but very important battle, nevertheless, I think.
So in terms of, you know, obviously there's a number of these battles, in addition to Towton, which other one or two would you mark probably as the most significant?
Well, if you break it down into the Wars of the Roses into periods, so I suppose if you said the first conflict is between Richard of York initially and Henry VI, well, you know, Richard overplays his hand and going from wanting to be, I suppose, sort of regent, he then goes on to claim the crown, and it all goes pear-shaped for him at Wakefield. He gave battle in vain and he's killed, and the Yorkist cause is taken up by his son Edward of March, Edward IV. So for that war, you know, it's Towton. You then got in 1469 to 1471. You've got that changing of sides of the Earl of Warwick, you know, brought about because of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. You know, I would. You know, beautiful, etc. You know, and I think that you know, it put. Sorry about that.
He does. He does this to me every time.
But you know, the thing about the Woodvilles is they came with a pay attention here. You know, you know, they came with a load of relatives.
Oh, that's it then. Seriously,
yeah.
Seriously.
So the Woodvilles hoover up the marriage market.
They do.
And Warwick needs to get his daughters married, and you know, and the Nevilles for years have been doing that, and now they can't do it anymore. And I think that's the main reason why he switches sides. He wants to marry off his daughter to Clarence. He can't do it. You know, Edward is favouring this family as he needed to, really, because you can't go relying on the Nevilles forever, can you? You've got to broaden your support. And you know, he tries to control Edward. He fails. He then tries to replace him, and poor old Henry VI is taken out from wherever he was and given a clean pair of pants and dusted down and portrayed. And it's a very tragic thing, you know. But there he is, King Henry, and he's there. And Warwick and Margaret of Anjou have this extraordinary alliance of convenience. It's said that Margaret kept Warwick on his knees for quite a long time, apologising for what had happened before.
Yes, of course.
The fourth priest is metal. It's funny, isn't it? Armour was made to measure, wasn't it? You didn't, you know, you couldn't just grab any. And I don't know about you, I've got this dinner jacket. And every time I put it on, it seems to have got slightly smaller.
Lot of my clothes shrank during.
You know what? Yours, of course, but because you're Pilates, you see, you're fine, whatever. So I often wonder about Edward IV. He has to go back to war again, you know, when he was a fit young man. Whether, oh God, this queer ass doesn't quite fit. Whether he had to get new stuff, you know, I don't know. But he goes off into exile. He comes back. He defeats Warwick. And the Earl of Oxford at Barnet in 1471, takes out the Nevilles, really, because Warwick and his brother Montague are killed at Barnet, and it breaks the power of the Nevilles. And then he divvies up the Nevilles' lands, you know, some to Clarence, but a lot to Richard of Gloucester, which gives Gloucester that power base that we know he had in the north. He's still got to deal with Margaret of Anjou, and he defeats her at Tewkesbury, so in May 1471. And the key thing, I suppose, about that battle, other than the fact that Edward isn't very forgiving after Tewkesbury to the Lancastrians, the Lancastrians are there. Didn't matter whether they went into Tewkesbury Abbey or whatever, you know, a lot of them are executed. But the key death there is Edward, Prince of Wales, who is Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI's son. God knows how Henry managed to produce a son. You know, I sometimes think maybe, you know, Margaret sort of climbed aboard when he was in one of his catatonic states. I don't know.
Divine intervention, yes.
Or maybe actually he wasn't as saintly as his hagiographers would make out he was. You know, we like to think of him, don't we, as this innocent kind of, you know, but actually in reality, you know, he was a little bit more switched on, obviously turned on then, switched on than we give him credit for. But the loss of, I think, of Edward being killed at Tewkesbury, that's really a death sentence for Henry VI, because, you know, you kept him alive, because if you killed him off, the leader of the Lancastrian faction is someone a bit better. But once that person, Edward, is killed, Henry's days are numbered, and he's quickly done away with, who knows by whom. And really, Edward has won the Wars of the Roses, hasn't he, to all intents and purposes. You know, John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, potters around the coast, ends up at St. Michael's Mount, sponsored by the French for a little bit of raiding, a little raidette here and there. But that's it, isn't it, really? You know, Harlech holds out, but that's it. Edward has won. And he can then enjoy the fruits of his victory, get fat, and die really too early. And it's another one of those great ifs, isn't it? Ifs and what? If, you know, he survived another 5 years, and his kids had reached maturity, who knows what would happen. But
there was nothing really to say at that point, was there? That if he had just carried on, that literally everything would have run its course.
Well, I don't think I agree. Yeah, and it's
brilliant.
It's an inane comparison. It's a bit like Tito in Yugoslavia, where the presence of Tito held everybody together, didn't it? You know, and when Tito went, Yugoslavia broke into its component parts and started to war. Where, you know, if you look at the Yorkist affinity at the end of that period, you know, you've got William Hastings, haven't you? You've got the Woodvilles, you've got Richard of Gloucester, you've got Clarence, you've got fed up with him, you know, and so on and so on. What held them together really was Edward IV. And once he's gone, it starts to crumble, doesn't it? And you start to see these factions breaking apart, and well, we all know what happens, in my opinion, for a defensive reason, Richard of Gloucester, first of all, wants to be regent. So he's got to get the kids out of the hands of the Woodvilles, and then it goes on to claim the throne. And in a way, it's very similar to his dad, isn't it? Because, you go back to 1460, and his dad wants to be kind of regent of the country, whatever you want to call it at that time, but then realizes that, whilst Margaret's there and so on and so on, he'll never be secure, so he goes for the throne. Well, I think it's similar with Richard III, but he pays a price for that because it destroys the Yorkist affinity, which is why I find it difficult to see Richard III as a Yorkist, because he's alienated most of the Yorkist affinity. He's left with what? His supporters in the north of England, and there's a good chance he would have been a very effective king. I think he seems to have been a good administrator, and he clearly was courageous. But he never got over, in my opinion, the way that he took the throne. I think that he was doomed from that point onwards. That there was no chance, and had his brother lived to a ripe old age, I think Richard of Gloucester would have been an effective, much loved, grand old man in the north of England, administering that and giving the Scots good kicking from time to time, But history had other plans, didn't it?
Just slightly.
Yes.
Oh God, what a horrendous mess that all turned out to be. I'm kind of the opinion it was something that what you just said there about, and you said earlier about it becoming, Henry versus Richard, and that thing about Richard almost not being a Yorkist was actually something that came up bizarrely in a conversation I saw on Facebook a few weeks ago, which had kind of divided itself into Lancastrians and Yorkists, which wasn't the point of the original poster. But somebody did actually say, I don't count, Richard as, I consider myself a Yorkist, and I don't appreciate what happened to Bosworth, and I think that Tudor was a usurper, but in my eyes, we had the Tudor dynasty because of Richard.
Yeah.
If he hadn't, and I'm probably going to get hate mail now, and that's really not my intention. This is just one viewpoint, that whether these boys were illegitimate or not, I'm not saying he killed them. They might have gone somewhere and lived to ripe old ages. We don't know what happened to them, so I'm never going to say that because we don't know. But had he come in, and I agree, I think he would have had a splendid protectorate. I think he would have been jolly good at it, and as these things go, I think it would have gone quite well. And there always would have been that tension with the Woodvilles, but Edward would have come of age. You've got an heir and a spare. The sisters would have got good marriages, and it could have all just gone along quite. And this line could have perhaps continued fairly successfully. But as you say, it's that pivotal point, the way Richard became king, whether that was the right thing to do or not. Nobody knows exactly what happened with the princes and everything like that, but that just, it split the Yorkists, and the Yorkists were very powerful, and that was it. It was.
Yeah, I think whether he would have had a splendid protectorate, because my feeling, and I don't really know, do we really know enough about it? But you get this feeling that the two boys were very much Woodville children. And so you'd never be quite secure. And I don't know how powerful the Yorkist affinity was. I think it was quite a fragile thing that was held, it's my view, by Edward IV. But it's significant, isn't it, that you look at Buckingham's rebellion, and that many of the people that took part in Buckingham's rebellion were part of Edward's household.
Yeah. Yeah.
And once that had happened, and Richard has then got to replace them with his people, which tend to come from the north, and it all then starts to get messy. But it was I think that we talk about York versus Lancaster, wasn't really like that. That affinity, the Yorkist affinity, was a fragile thing. But what you need to do is you need to win a nice victory, don't you? Because that legitimizes your regime.
Absolutely.
So if Richard has managed to be victorious at Bosworth, he can say, look, God has shown his approval. Which is, you look at Agincourt. Well, Agincourt didn't really decide anything as a battle. Henry V had to come back 2 years later and do the proper conquest. What it did do, though, was a huge propaganda coup for the House of Lancaster. and in a way, I think that one could look at Bosworth in that way, and a win for Richard there, I think, not only would it have taken out his chief rival, but it wouldn't half have given his regime some kudos. But it wasn't to me, was it?
It wasn't. No. This is a question that I've asked Mike Ingram and I've asked Matt Lewis, and I'm going to get Nathan with it next time I speak to him. This is real conjecture. Do you think Richard felt that he should have won the day? How would he have felt going in the night before when he was supposed to have seen bad omens and been very unrestful? Do you think on paper he should have won, or do you think we didn't know the exact French numbers? People tend to underestimate the skill of the French and things like that. So do you think Richard would have had a reason to go in quite confidently, and the whole thing came as a bit of a surprise to everybody, or it was just an unknown quantity?
I think very few people go into a battle expecting to lose. Mm-hmm. You don't give battle, I think, if you're expecting to lose, unless you have no choice.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Richard had a choice at Bosworth. He didn't have to give battle at that time. So I presume that he was expecting to win. He had greater numbers. Who knows about the fighting abilities of the two armies? Who knows? Obviously, if you're going to read a French source, you have all this about the French basically winning the battle for Henry Tudor. We got this letter, haven't we? That's not the original letter, sort of saying that. But it doesn't even say we won the battle. It says we were in part responsible for Henry's victory. I kind of agree. I think Mike Ingram has said this, and I think most people probably agree that the Stanleys. It was pretty clear which side the Stanleys were going to fight at this battle. Both of them. I mean, I think sometimes one is too ready to lump them together as the Stanleys, rather than the Thompson William. But I think that it was pretty clear which side they were going to go. After all, they've got some Stanley troops in Henry Tudor's army. So it was not a question, I think, of who they would support. It was basically when they would come into the battle. I think so. So I would have thought that Richard is expecting victory. You can give battle otherwise. I don't think in that way. But exactly what happens, it's very. I do tours around it, as you know, and it's lovely to be able to do a very good narrative about this happened and that happened and that. But we really don't know. I mean, we've done the work that the Battlefields Trust was involved in a few years ago in locating where the battle was fought, and that was done through a number of things, really. So they looked at the chronicles, they looked at the ground to find that. I'm going off on one about this, but it's probably the time to do it.
It's very relevant to the Tudors.
Yeah, they found the marsh that played a part in it. They found the names of the old roads and fields, which kind of helped pinpoint where to look. And then the metal detecting was done, and they found all the shots, that was probably fired mainly from Richard's guns. But we know where it was fought, but I don't think we really know quite enough about how it was fought, to be honest. I would be wary myself in going into too much detail about it. I don't think we know exactly where people were. We rely quite heavily on something like, I don't know, the Ballads of Bosworth, but we say that there's sort of hundreds of guns there, including bombards. Well, there clearly weren't any bombards at Bosworth. It's hard to say, isn't it? Bombards but they're used for they're used for banging down walls, aren't they? And so if that word is the wrong word, but it was used for poetic reasons, what about other words in it?
Yeah.
So we have some idea, and I think we have a bit of a chronology about what happened, but exactly who did what and where people were. There's Mike Ingram's come up with quite a good argument about the disposition of the troops. I've seen other equally good arguments. They're all hypotheses because we don't really know to be absolutely sure who was where, I think, and all of the chronicles, they've got ulterior motives, haven't they, in the way that they write about it. So who knows, and to a certain extent, it's like trying to understand Bannockburn through Braveheart, isn't it?
Don't
You
do
know? So there we are. But clearly a crucial battle, and people commented afterwards that Henry Tudor came from nowhere, didn't he? Really borrowed money. I think he had, my own view is he kind of had to borrow money to hire French mercenaries. I don't think that the King of France was kind of pulling the strings, but
goodness of his heart.
Yeah, and he's got a lot of his key fighters are disgruntled Yorkists. Yorkists, people like John Cheney is a good example of that. Who had been quite close in it, but to all intents and purposes, he was sort of a bodyguard of Edward IV. Great big bloke, wasn't he, John Cheney? I heard 6'4", 6'7". I know that they opened up his John Cheney then. So John Cheney, people don't know, was this big guy. He'd been in the Yorkist affinity prior to Richard III, got involved in the plots against Richard, first of all in favour, I think, of the princes, and then after that, as in favour of Henry VII. Joined Henry VII, and I see him as one of his kind of minders, really. Great big bloke. And when Richard launched his last charge at Bosworth in a bid to, end it all by killing the Pretender, which he would have done, of course, he manages to kill Brandon, who is Henry Tudor's standard bearer. Well, given that standard bearer tends to be where the leader is, he must have got pretty near to Richard, but Cheney gets in the way. But Richard unhorses him as well. But it seems enough to buy enough time. And if you go to Salisbury Cathedral, there's his tomb, and it's just this guy with long sort of hair and a collar of S's standing. He's there on this tomb. And when they did a bit of tidying up in the 18th century, and they moved the tombs around, they opened it up, and by what was in there, they concluded that he was a big guy. Incidentally, I'm not having it that people say that somehow Henry was a snivelling coward because he wasn't in the front rank.
No, that annoys me as well.
Let's go off on one about this very briefly.
I agree with you.
When James IV announced at Flodden that he was going to go in the front rank, the nobles were horrified about it. And they said, it's not the place for the king to be in the front rank. If you're in the front rank, you are no more than another soldier.
Yeah.
Out of it. Because he wasn't having any of it. And quite bravely, James IV said it from, well, I expect my subjects to do these things for me. I need to share their risks. So he goes into the front rank, which means that all the other nobles have to go in the front rank. And it's a disaster, isn't it? You don't have Edward III in the front rank at the Battle of Crecy, for example, So it's not appropriate for somebody to be. And clearly, if Richard III, for him to be able to launch his charge, he couldn't be in the front rank either. He had to have been in some area, on the battlefield. So, there's no doubt that Richard was a brave soldier, etc., and courageous, and you had to handle himself.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But and maybe Henry VII wasn't that. But what Henry VII did do was he was able to inspire loyalty amongst the people that he needed to inspire loyalty with. And you see that, don't you, at the Battle of Stoke a couple of years later. Yeah. So there's different types of leadership, isn't there, and it seems to me that Henry had it myself. That's not to denigrate Richard, who was clearly died bravely.
Oh, absolutely.
They're different things, but I won't have it when people think of Henry as some kind of snivelling coward.
Yeah, no,
historians don't do that. It's not historians that
I think as well, what gets me about that is when I hear people say that, they're often people who don't like assumptions being made about other people, but are quite happy to make those assumptions themselves.
Well, that's up to them. I can only say my view on it, and that is
what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
I just think that Henry was in the right place, really.
Oh, absolutely. And it was what it was. So.
Yeah, you don't raise an army to make you king and then go in the front rank and get taken out by an arrow in the first minute of the battle. But it's a waste of everybody's time, isn't it?
Like, we'll go home then. Yeah. We rocks up here, walk down here for God knows how long. We're all knackered and starving. That's the end of that.
But such a crucial moment in our history in many ways, isn't it? And as you know, we've been a bit upset recently because of the building of a car testing track on part of the battlefield, and that was a bit of a blow. It's only, I say only, but it's not a large percentage of the battlefield of Bosworth that's been damaged by that. But that's not the point, is it? Imagine going to Stonehenge and just taking away one of the stones. It's only one of the stones, and it does appear to have been in a relatively important part of the battlefield. And it's one of the things that the Battlefields Trust tries to do, I suppose, is to protect these places. And how do you do it? Well, really, through stuff like we're doing now, isn't it? That we all do. It's by getting people interested in it. And if you can do that, it's the best protection. Anybody can wave a placard around or lie down in front of a bulldozer. Well, they can't. I'm not going to lie down for them, but you know what I mean. Whereas if you can just build up the understanding and the interest in it that we all have, that's the best way of protecting our battlefields, I reckon. I remember when I started work for the Battlefields Trust many years ago, and there was a battle at Solway Moss, part of the Rough Wooing, which was in the 50, or at that time anyway, and the Scots mounted a big raid down towards Carlisle, and the English, very small English army, bushwhacked them. Really, they were kind of border reaver types, and they hit and run attacks on the Scots, and the Scots kind of fell back over the border, and it really went home. And so it's a registered battle, and I thought I rang up to Carlisle Tourist Information just to see what they thought of Solway Moss, And I said, I hear there was a battle at Solway Moss. What's it? And this chap said, I wouldn't bother with that. It's just a field, he said,
Oh, no.
And I thought, right, this is what we all need to battle against, isn't it? Throughout all these places are so much more than fields, aren't they? They're places where our history was made, where our ancestors. I mean, there's a good chance that one of our ancestors was in one of these battles.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very good chance, isn't there? If you think about the sort of way that the demographic works, so they need to be protected, don't they? And you can look at them in terms of the archaeology, and you go to Flodden, and it doesn't half help being there to understand what happened with a sort of steep slope going down to the river where the Lancastrians tumbled into the water. You really get a feel for it there. Or going through the back streets of St Albans. Well, that sounds like a song, doesn't it? Peter Sarstead, I digress. So it's important, I think, from that point of view. But they're memorials, aren't they? These are where our ancestors fought and died, and for that reason alone, I think they're worth preserving.
That's a good point, because we have battles that are in or periods of warfare that are in more recent history, even though we don't remember them. So obviously, we are very mindful, as indeed we should be, of the First and Second World Wars and things like that. And I think if that was something like that, people would stand up and want to protect it, because it's so far back in history. It's not viewed with the same empathy or understanding, and it's almost like it doesn't exist. But actually, like when you're at Bosworth and they have the silence before they do the battle reenactment, and I think that's really important, because it's so easy, because this happened such a long time ago, to not think of these people as real people.
No, exactly.
Went into horrific, indescribably awful situations.
Yeah.
As did people in the First and Second World Wars. Things were a little bit different, but essentially they were the same.
Yes.
You've just been pulled out of your everyday life to have a tiny little bit of training, to sit in some horrible, rubbish conditions, to be thrown to the wolves. And that's it. And these are all people that died for a cause that wasn't theirs. And it's horrible. And they deserve to be remembered, and those areas preserved just as much.
Well, I think so. That's exactly how I see it. So thank you for saying that.
I have my uses every now and again.
Many uses. Rebecca, this is a great site. Yeah. But I agree, absolutely. And they are people. They are our ancestors. That's the thing. But almost certainly, our ancestors, people that whose DNA we're carrying now, were at Towton, were at Bosworth. We may not know who they were, but they were there.
Oh, you know, I'd absolutely love to have it traced back, and someone that I was related to as a Bosworth. That would like make my whole entire life. Julian, thank you so much.
Well, it's lovely to chat.
You have all entertained me appropriately and occasionally inappropriately, as always. And I really value our conversations, and it's so lovely to talk to you. Now, we had discussed, haven't we, at some stage coming back to have a talk about castles, because Julian knows lots about castles, and I like a good castle. I do. So
Yes.
a good castle. So we will get that in place at some stage in the proceedings. But thank you so much.
Before I go, can I be tedious and say, if anybody would like to know a bit more about the Battlefields Trust, I'm sure many of the people that are watching will know it, and many will be members, I expect. But if you'd like to know a bit about it, www.battlefieldstrust.com.
What I'll do is, when I put the video up, I'll put lots of information in the show notes.
Sounds great.
Video as well.
Lovely to chat.
Yes, we will do this again sometime, but hopefully it won't be too long before we actually get to meet. But
fingers crossed. Yeah.
Yeah. But thank you so much. Take care, and I will speak to you soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.